I came in and said, I want to change the world. And my boss said, great, here I have somebody who is able to do things a different way. Basically, to do that, this would require about 6 billion euro investment within the next 6 years. So you can imagine that's straightforward. Originally, I was thinking it has nothing to do with this, until my customers proved me wrong. They say, look, our conditions have changed, the model doesn't really fit, and therefore we don't use it anymore. The more diverse cultural backgrounds you have in the team, the more likely it is that you can solve a problem that is not obvious. The way how I function is I get inspiration by discussing.
Hello everyone, my name is Olga Shembrikas, I'm Project Director at BGS Group, and today we are filming BGS Talks YouTube interview series. I'm having my guest, Thomas Heinzerling, Senior Vice President, Advanced Operations Services at Linde. Thomas, it's nice having you here. Thank you.
Thank you for talking with me.
Let's start with your professional experience. We have already started having that communication. Right, in one PRC interview from 2 years ago, by the way, we watched that.
Oh, you mean in Helsinki? Or?
In Helsinki, yes. You mentioned that you spent 20 years in plant building. Mm-hmm. So what was the inspiration for you to make it that long? 20 years, that's impressive.
Yeah, I think the starting point was that I like to explore different countries, and working for a company that builds plants all over the world, I mean, this was the chance for me to see the world and experience people in a working life, not as a tourist. And I think that was the one reason. The other thing, I mean, you have seen me and I get bored pretty easily, is that Linde, the company where I'm working, I mean, gave me the chance. Every 3 years, I had either a different job or a different place to work. And so my initial plan to go to Linde, work for 3 years and then take off didn't actually work out because they were moving me around and giving me more and more challenging and quite interesting jobs and topics to work on.
And what exactly kept you inspired for staying in Linde for such a long period?
I think it was, I was very lucky with my bosses. And I think basically from day one, I had a boss who was willing to embrace a revolutionary. So I came in and said, I want to change the world. And my boss said, great, here I have somebody who is able to do things a different way. And so over the whole course of my career, I had, let's say, managers who actually enjoyed that they had somebody who would do things differently or would try to do new things.
And now you're the boss.
And now it's more tolerated because I'm the boss, yes.
And you're the inspiration for the younger generation.
I'm trying to do that. What I'm trying to create now with my organization is basically the degree of freedom that I got as a young engineer to basically provide this space to try out new things to my colleagues and the newbies that we have in the group.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Getting back to the first questions about the building plants, you're now operating plants, right? And what's more challenging?
I think for me it was operating plants because when you build plants, you basically deal, so that's straightforward science. When you operate plants, you mostly deal with people, and you deal, I mean, you know that I was responsible for Asia Pacific, so from Pakistan to Indonesia to Australia to China, the way how people function and what is important for them and how do you get them to a point where they do whatever you think you want them to do is very different. So this I found quite challenging, and one of the key problems that I was starting with is that we had a very bad safety record, and so this is really about personal individual behavior of one human being. And as an engineer, that was not my, main domain. How do I convince a driver in India that he sleeps before he comes to work and doesn't drive off the street?
Asia Pacific, Pakistan, China, Germany, right? Also, we came here, you mentioned
Yeah.
USA, right? Regional aspects. That is another important aspect, right, of communicating with the people from the whole Earth, right?
Yeah.
Let's say
Yeah.
maybe Antarctica, right? I do not know.
Yeah.
Australia,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, that's Asian Pacific region. Would you be able to tell the secret of the communication? So, what's actually the secret of keeping that strong bonds, for collaboration, for communication between different regions, between different countries?
I think it's, let's say, one part is, and this might be a prerequisite. I'm quite curious about dealing with people. So I'm curious about what drives you, why do you do things, and very often it was about creating a connection to whoever was my counterpart. I think we talked about it. So my first job was in Wuhan, in China. I didn't speak Chinese. My counterparts didn't speak English. And it was mainly trying to find out what do we both want. And of course, there was a common goal is I wanted to get the plant started up and go home. And they wanted to get the plant started up and produce. And so we started with, okay, so we're kind of trying to do this together. And one part which was quite important was having fun together. So it was enjoying things, pulling each other's leg. And after some time, I mean, we could even bridge the Chinese and so the language barrier because we didn't speak the same language. So we basically made joke about each other and we laughed together and we went through hard times together.
Wow. So in the nutshell, if, for example, the younger operator who just came to Linde would come to you and ask, Thomas, would you be able to give me an advice how to deal with the people that, let's say, spread across all over the world? What would you say?
Well, in a nutshell, for me, it would be number one, relax. Number two, listen. And number three, try to understand what is important for your counterpart. And this could be different values. It could be a different way of, for example, dealing with managers. I had a team where parts of the people came from Sweden and others came from US. So the more experienced ones that were much more experienced than me were from US. They never contradicted me. Well, when I went into the Swedish group, they immediately said, Thomas, this is completely what you're talking about. And so it's about trying to understand is how does communication work? How is the resolution of conflicts or the expression of a different opinion, how does that work? And then go with that and be sensitive to what is coming from your counterpart or whoever you deal with.
Thank you. Thank you. So that would be advice for myself as well. Thank you. So let's move to the next part, which is really important part. That's about Linde, think hydrogen. First of all, that's a really nice page on the website, really nice design. Well, when I was reading, so Linde is a global leader in producing, right, storage, distribution of hydrogen. Why hydrogen became the key focus of the company for now?
Yeah, I mean, the starting point was, we are producing hydrogen for more than 20 years. We run 1,000 kilometers of hydrogen pipelines. We have more than 150 plants. And so hydrogen for a very long time was part of our core business, gray hydrogen. And it was a very profitable one because let's say it's more difficult than to produce oxygen because it's a little bit more safety relevant, and you needed a high integration with your customer because you needed feed gas from somewhere. And why has it become important? Because we have the infrastructure available. We have the infrastructure to produce. We know how to do it. We have pipelines. We know how to ship hydrogen with trucks. We know how to fill it into vehicles. And so the infrastructure was ready, and we had a lot of operating experience how to handle hydrogen. And then all of a sudden, decarbonization comes along, and hydrogen is all of a sudden in the middle of that. And of course, we saw a chance to use whatever we have in terms of infrastructure and know-how, and basically expand in a market that is, let's say, growing very fast, and where we also expect that over the next 10 years there will be very massive growth.
And so then, what are the competitive advantages of clean hydrogen, let's say, right? So we're talking about blue and we're talking about green, right? Yeah. So what would be the competitive advantages in comparison with other clean energy sources?
I mean, if we start with the blue hydrogen, I mean, the key thing is you can use existing infrastructure, so you can use the existing production processes, you can use the existing transport media, you can use existing technology, and you can decarbonize straight away by just taking the CO2 out of the hydrogen production, which means you can gradually move to a world with less CO2 emissions without completely turning everything upside down. And we have a lot of technology how to send hydrogen through an existing natural gas pipeline. We have technologies how to change, for example, cracking furnaces from natural gas to hydrogen without, major open heart surgery where you create major trouble.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned about like future, right? So it can be, it will be, or it can be the huge development. So what can be the forecast?
It will be a huge development. So there's actually no question about the size. The only question is about the timeline and how fast are certain things going to happen. Because, I mean, if we talk about blue hydrogen, we're doing that today. And we have huge projects in the US financed by Joe Biden and the IRA. We have huge projects in Europe where we're doing this today with the existing technology that is quite mature. What is, let's say, not that clear is how fast are we going towards green hydrogen, because that requires a lot of infrastructure that is not existing. So we need, let's say, we need renewable energy generation, wind, solar power. We need a way to store either electricity or hydrogen. And we need, let's say, a vast increase in electrical infrastructure to transport the electrical energy to be able to produce that. And that part is, for me, a bit unclear, and also for us as Linde and probably for the whole industry, how fast will that move? Because that's mainly driven by legislation. It's mainly driven by incentives or taxes or laws that force the industry down that road.
Mm-hmm. And can you name some of the measures, from the side of the legislation, like maybe within Europe, right? If we're talking about, for example.
Yeah, I mean, in Europe, I think one of the things for long term, which is great, is basically the CO2 tax. The only problem at the moment is, and I think we were working with, for example, one of the global European oil and gas companies on a sustainable aviation fuel project. And the problem is that at the moment the CO2 price is too low to make this project feasible, because the price of sustainable aviation fuel is so much higher than the price of the current aviation fuel that this project will not fly unless the CO2 price goes up.
Linde is now working with a Daimler Truck, right, on liquid hydrogen. Also, there's a project. Yep. What are the main challenges that you're facing for now? So I know hydrogen, basically that's a gas, yes. Right? So you're working with liquid hydrogen. So how do you assess the impact of this project? So what is that? Because before the interview, I have never heard about it. Yeah.
No, I think, I mean, the funny thing is, I mean, it sounds very challenging. It's actually much less challenging than you think, because despite the fact that liquid hydrogen has a very low boiling point, so if you bring it to normal temperature, it will just evaporate. But other than that, a liquid hydrogen filling station is much less costly, much less complex than hydrogen refueling stations for gas, because the gas you have to compress to 800 bars. So you have a flammable gas, you have to compress it to 800 bar, and you have the operator that is a car driver like you and me. which is something that is, let's say, is quite challenging. While if you just fill a liquid with a pump into a tank, it's actually not such a big deal. And so technically, for a company that is able to handle cryogenic liquids for 140 years, it's actually not that complicated. And so we would actually prefer liquid hydrogen because it's a tank with a liquid, a pump, and it goes into the tank, and that's it.
And can it become the next fuel? Can it
Yes.
become the fuel of the future?
No,
And
no,
what terms?
absolutely. I mean, the liquid hydrogen has a huge advantage is because you can store a lot of energy in a small space with relatively limited amount of weight. And so if we talk about long distance trucking, if we talk about ferries or shipping, this is certainly the fuel of choice. Because, for example, a liquid hydrogen truck can easily go 1,000 kilometers with one load of hydrogen. If you take the best battery today, it's only 500 kilometers. And then the hydrogen truck basically still has quite a lot of volume left because the tank is not very big, neither is it very heavy. So you have a much higher payload and you have much more volume for the truck left for whatever you want to transport compared to batteries and of course also compared to gaseous hydrogen. And so wherever you need a lot of energy, the liquid hydrogen certainly is the fuel. The problem though is in Europe there's basically nobody who produces liquid hydrogen. So the challenge on the long run is we need to ramp up the liquid hydrogen production capacity. In US it's much better, so we produce quite a lot of liquid hydrogen there, but in Europe there's nothing. And if we look at, I mean, you know, this EU target of 2030 for heavy duty vehicles. So if we want to reach that, we've done the math, so you would need 1,250 liquid hydrogen refueling stations, and you would need 2,500 tons per day liquid hydrogen production in 6 years. And basically to do that, this would require about 6 billion euro investment within the next 6 years. So you can imagine that's straightforward.
Linde certainly supports the decarbonization strategy from different perspectives. We have already spoken about hydrogen, right, and the influence. We are going to talk about the decarbonization all in all, right? So just the overall question, the common question. So why decarbonization is important for now? We are talking about that for years, right? Since at least 2015, right? From starting since Paris Agreement in December or November, right? So the first part, why decarbonization is important, and the second part can be who are or which are the main parties for now.
Yeah. So why is it important? I think is relatively simple. Is because there is political pressure now, serious political pressure. Certain things are not allowed anymore, or there is taxation on CO2, for example, on the one side, and there's a lot of incentives and subsidies to do decarbonization. So it becomes a real topic rather than just lip service. And there's a couple of industries, including the refining industry, who now start to move because they get worried that if they don't do anything now, they will be out of business or they will have a major problem. I think that's the trigger, because as long as it was just it's nice to be somebody who decarbonizes, nothing really moved, nobody would invest in something. And now there's funding, there's pressure, there's incentives that move the boat. Who are the key players? It's basically the people who deal with carbon. So, I mean, we were at this petrochemical and refining conference. So there's a question of what is next and how do you decarbonize. So the hydrogen is a big topic, of course. We deal with cement manufacturers, for example, in order to capture the CO2, because the problem is the CO2 is a result of the process to make cement. So there's no way to replace that. So here the question is, how can we catch the CO2 and deposit it somewhere? Then of course we have let's say the aviation industry, where there's no short-term way to replace engines of a plane by something that doesn't use fuel. So here the question is, can we produce fuel that has a lower carbon footprint? And last but not least, which is more, let's say, talked about a lot, but it's actually in terms of the influence not that big, is of course mobility. And we have the steel industry, who is now basically decarbonizing by going to direct reduction process technology.
Moving to your part, the digital part, Linde has a number of automation and digitization projects, or digitalization projects. How do you estimate the influence of these kind of projects on decarbonization goals?
Yeah. Originally I was thinking it has nothing to do with this, until my customers proved me wrong. And what we see is, and I think we have, I was talking about this sustainable aviation fuel project, is what you get is, you get three major changes in producing fuels or plastic. Number one, you have to go where your raw material comes from. And this leads to the fact that you will have a lot of smaller assets or plants that are distributed. And if you do that, the classical concept to operate a refinery doesn't work anymore, where you have 1,000 people in one place, because you will have a small site here, a small site there, they're all over the place. And if you now use the same organization model, you will need so many people that this doesn't become feasible. So the one part, and this is something that has given us a huge boost, is if you want to operate decentralized smaller assets in a commercially viable way, you need to have them automated, and you need to remote operate them, because then in principle you can have one crew that operates plants all over the place rather than having multiple crews. So that's the one driver. The other part is, some of these things, the new plants are quite sophisticated. And let's talk about, for example, hydrogen refueling stations. I mean, if you fill diesel into a tank, you have a pump and a valve, and you switch on the pump, and that's it. If you want to refuel a hydrogen car, you need to compress hydrogen to 800 bars. You have to have a tight connection. You have to subcool the the gas, so that the tank doesn't overpressurize. And so all of a sudden you get a very sophisticated piece of hazardous infrastructure, and the operator is the facility manager of a supermarket, or the operator is a car driver. And in order to manage the safety and efficiency aspects of that, you need a very high degree of automation, because otherwise you cannot reproduce it, because you cannot have a crew on every of these stations. And this, of course, is fostering the advanced automation parts that we do, because number one is you have to run it automatically on the ground. Number two is you typically have to remote monitor what is happening, because if the automation gets stuck, you need somebody to troubleshoot this. And again, this is pushing the same thing. What happens is that, let's say, the production processes become much more dynamic. And as soon as they become dynamic, it becomes difficult for humans to do that. And that's the other part of our business, is to automatically control and optimize dynamic processes with fluctuating feed composition, with fluctuating power availability, and also with different products that you want to produce depending upon the market, just because of the volatility. So for us, really, really great. All parameters become more difficult for human beings, and so naturally you would then move towards more automated plants, but also for remote monitored or remote operated assets.
Thank you for such a complex answer. You told me about virtual furnace, and let's switch the topic to e-furnace.
Yes.
That's a really interesting project that you do with your partners, SABIC and BASF, right? So that's a huge project. That's a real example of industry collaboration, first of all, and then that's a good example of a project aimed at decarbonization, because first of all, steam cracking requires a huge amount of energy, right? So beyond reducing CO2 emissions, what are the key advantages? What are the key peculiarities for this project? Can you name some of them?
Yeah, I mean, to say a positive thing is, I think, three companies who have quite a different view to what is the perspective where they want to go came together, and surprisingly are working together quite well. So you have a German petrochemical company who basically wants to innovate, let's say, looking at European legislation and being ready for that. And then you have a Middle Eastern company who's basically preparing for the longer term future. And then you have an engineering partner like Linde who is trying to satisfy both of them. And what I see is, and that for me was a surprise, this triangle of three partners with significantly different view of where they want to go with this, is pushing each other to something that really is about to work quite well. So that for me was the one part. The other part, and that's of course nice, is we're trying to prove a technology on a small scale, but in a way that we can immediately scale up, because in principle this might be smaller, but it's just more of the same. It's not something different. And the other part that is happening, I mean, we decarbonize, of course, because we don't use gas, but the other thing that we learned here is that, and this is happening in a lot of the cases, is that we shift from challenges in process engineering to challenges in electrical engineering. So it's kind of the unfriendly takeover of the process industry by electrical engineers, because all of a sudden the key challenge is how do you control significant streams of electrical power rather than steam or rather than burning something.
Let's talk about the power of teamwork. Yeah, you already started talking about that, but in any case, that's it also like covers the initial question about the regional aspects, right? Because the company originally from Saudi Arabia, SABIC, right? Two German companies, right? Linde and BASF. So what can be the challenges? What can be the advantages? So how do you collaborate with each other? So can you share some insights, maybe some interesting points?
And I think this is not necessarily only in this project. I mean, what I see, and I've also tried to make this possible within my team, the more diverse cultural backgrounds you have in the team, the more likely it is that you can solve a problem that is not obvious. Because you have people who have different ways to approach a problem, you have people who have different ideas about doing that. And I think that's one of the advantages, for example, of having SABIC in there, who's not a German company. Because sometimes you get ideas that, let's say, two German companies would just haggle forever and get stuck with something, and then you have a kind of a fresh idea from the side coming into the game. And my personal conviction is, if you have these multicultural teams, be it different companies, be it teams of the same company working together, specifically when you go into unknown territory, it's much more likely that, let's say, they will be successful, is my view.
So it's all about like having no prejudice, let's say, no boundaries when you do not know where to step in. Actually,
yeah, and to have a different view towards the way how we solve problems. And I think I saw that, for example, specifically our Chinese colleagues very often come with ideas that we would never consider. who are slightly out of the range that a German would consider. And when we discuss, we say, yeah.
It's like thinking 360.
Exactly, yeah. And I think, I mean, typically, I mean, coming from a certain cultural background, you have a certain area in which you are looking, but if you have somebody else, they might have a different angle to it. And very often, let's say it's a combination also of the two angles that maybe gives the solution finally.
The final block, I would say, that's regarding the Petrochemical and Refining Congress. We have just attended that, right? You attended that for 3 years in a row, yes. Delivering the speeches within the panel discussions. I personally know that you like the panel discussions and you like deliver the message to the Congress attendees. Why do you think that's important?
If I think of my personal motivation to come to the Congress, it's mainly to get an idea of where are the problems, where is the industry going, what are they worried about, and discussing how could we overcome that problem. And on the other side, and typically I go home with names of people that I talk to afterwards, and we, let's say every single time we had projects that arose from that with partners that we would not have known or imagined that we can work together with. And why is this important? Is because you bring people, so you bring operators together, you bring equipment manufacturers together, you bring EPC companies together. And I think exactly to have this discussion with different angles of I'm building a plant, I'm operating a plant, I'm producing something, I'm bringing a piece of equipment. I think that the discussion between these different parties, I think, is generating the new idea about, okay, so how could we overcome a certain challenge? And I would imagine that's with the Petrochemical and Refining Congress, you create the forum where in a very relaxed atmosphere you can kind of brainstorm or discuss how could you interact, or how could one party solve the problem of somebody else. And I mean, my firm belief is that this is not something that you can do in a video conference. This is not something that you can plan. It needs a little bit of relaxed atmosphere. I mean, it happens during coffee or the lunch break, or somebody who you accidentally meet because you stand in the line and wait for the bus.
So you would agree that that relaxed atmosphere and informal networking for the parties, for you, that's an important thing?
Yeah, I would say it's the main thing, because I mean, when I think about what was the highlights of this petrochemical conference, I mean, it happened here. It didn't happen in the part. So, I mean, for me, the reason to be on the panel is to be visible, to provoke people that later on come and talk to me, and we figure out, is there any kind of common thing that we want to tackle? Is there anybody else who knows a solution to a problem that I have and don't know? And the relaxed atmosphere, I think, is the key prerequisite to make that possible.
So what's also the secret for your intensive networking? Once I told you, you're the head of networking, you're the leader of networking. I do not know if you remember that.
Yeah.
You remember that?
Yes.
Yeah. What's the secret? Maybe you can share to other participants how to network like Thomas Heinzerling.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually quite a trick question, I think. But,
maybe how you do that.
Yeah. I mean, the drive is, and I think that's what I was talking about, the way how I function is I get inspiration by discussing, by exchanging views, the more different the better, by arguing about something. And of course, I mean, you know that I'm very passionate about things, and I think part of it is probably that some people like the passion, and they come and say, look, you were doing all these kinds of stage. Can you talk a little bit about what is this actually? So I think that's the part. The other part is probably I'm trying to ask questions about where do you come from, what is driving you, why are you talking to me, and that I saw here a couple of times, people are sometimes quite surprised that I'm not trying to sell them something in the first place. Of course I want, but that I'm interested in what is your problem, how do you work, and share, let's say, the parts where I'm troubled, and say, look, I have this trouble. Do you have a solution for me? And I think it's probably this kind of mutual balance of, can you tell me something about what you are doing, and can you help me? And I'm happy to share what's my trouble and how I can help you. And of course, it's the principal curiosity about getting to know people. So that for me, it doesn't really matter what they do. If they have an interesting story to tell, I would certainly listen, even though I might not know whether this is useful in a business sense ever.
So just the main thing, let's say, be curious, right?
Be curious and ask questions, I would say.
So that's the secret by you.
Yeah, probably.
Now
yeah.
we know.
Yeah.
Now we know. Thank you, Thomas. So that was a really interesting discussion. That was a really interesting interview. And thank you for coming. Thank you for being there.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
And listening.
Wish to see you sometime next year.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much.